And Taylor, I don't know a better way to start the book of Job than the first few lines of a beloved hymn. I know that my Redeemer lives. What comfort this sweet sentence gives. He lives. He lives who once was dead. He lives, my ever-living head. You'll notice that most of our hymns, they come to us in these poetic, beautiful phrases that often rhyme. Well, we jump today into the book of Job, which, to just orient us in where we've been, where we're now going to be, and where we're going to go, remember that we had the first 5 books of Moses called the Torah.
And I'm going to point out again, that word literally means instruction. And what instruction are we talking about? God's covenantal instructions and the stories of how people responded or did not respond to that covenantal instructions to be faithful to God. Follows actually the format of the Book of Mormon.
Beautiful. Then you get, so that's section 1 of our Old Testament, or the Hebrew Bible, or what our Jewish friends would call the Tanakh. The T in the Tanakh stands for the Torah. Then we enter into this phase of the Old Testament where we got the history books. So as Deuteronomy closed, you picked up Joshua, Judges, Ruth, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, and the Chronicles are kind of a repeat of the same period of time told from a different scribal perspective. And then you get into Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther. Last week, when we ended the Esther episode, that closes the history timeline section of the Old Testament. So that was all fairly chronological with that little retelling of the Chronicles. Now we open up a section of the Bible that is often referred to as the wisdom literature, and it's filled with poetry. Now, that doesn't mean to say that there wasn't poetry in some of the songs of, say, Moses, or some of the other elements that we've already covered in the history, but it really becomes prominent in the wisdom literature. And that is going to start with Job, and then a little bit of the wisdom literature in Psalms, intermixed, but a lot of poetry in the Psalms, and then Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and many in the Christian world and in the Jewish world would consider Song of Solomon or the Song of Songs as the final element of the wisdom literature. Joseph Smith, of course, comes to that and says this is not scripture, so we don't really spend a lot of time on that. And then we would get into the final section of the Old Testament, which is the words of the prophets. And those are not in chronological order, nor are they clustered by Northern Kingdom, Southern Kingdom. It's multiple prophets that have covered various time stamps within the history literature, but it comes there. So that's just to kind of orient us where we are at this point in our study of the Old Testament. We now open the chapters on wisdom literature.
The English word history and the English word wisdom both come from the same exact ancient root word, which has to do with seeing and insight. And so what we're getting here is ancient scribes giving us insight about why things happened. It's a history of how well did people follow the covenantal instructions. Wisdom is often pithy statements or compact statements of ideas that you could apply generally to your life. Now, you might look at the wisdom literature, and sometimes it's competing literature, or sometimes it's competing ideas. For example, even in our culture today, we talk about too many cooks in the kitchen spoil the broth. And then, it's kind of a wisdom saying we have. But we also talk about the power of multiple perspectives in a community when you're discussing something. Well, that's also a wise saying, and they're sometimes at odds at one another. And so wisdom literature is intended to be general statements that should be applied judiciously to specific contexts, but not slavishly that in all instances, every single thing here has to be applied at all times, just like our wise sayings today. And furthermore, when we get into the wisdom literature, it provides a perspective that is more of like the cultural milieu of the people, where these are the things that you would have heard people saying around the dinner table or out in the marketplace. Whereas the history is the edited version from a trained, inspired scribe or prophet who's helping people to see, here's what happens when people live or do not live God's covenantal instruction. So in some ways, the history is more of like the official view of what was going on, whereas the wisdom literature might more represent the common perspective that you might find out in the street or in the home.
It's very helpful. Now, as we jump into the book of Job, knowing this won't get you into heaven, but it does help, at least for some of you, to frame your study of the scriptures. The reality is Job chapter 1 and 2, it's not written in poetry form. It's written in prose still. It's more like a history of what's going on. It's just telling you events in Job's life in those first two chapters. And then chapter 3 opens up, and all of a sudden in the Hebrew, and I'm not a Hebrew expert, but I know a lot of people who are, and reading their work and their research, there's a distinct shift in the writing style of the Hebrew, starting with chapter 3, and it's going to continue in that Hebrew poetry form all the way down to the very last chapter, 42, verse 6. And then in verse 7, it's going to pop out of that Hebrew structure of poetry form and go back into a prose to tell the final part of the story, which, by the way, let's begin with the end in mind here, that Job is going to start with 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, 500 she-asses is how it refers to them. He's going to lose all of those. And in the very last chapter, in the very end of the book, he's going to end up with a doubling of every single one of those that were listed in chapter 1. You're going to have 14,000 sheep, 6,000 camels, 1,000 yoke of oxen, and 1,000 she-asses by the time he ends. He's going to lose his 7 sons and 3 daughters in the beginning of the story, and he's going to have 7 sons and 3 daughters at the ending of the story. And he's going to live many, many years beyond these trials and tribulations that he faces.